I'm speaking with Dr. Simone Brioni, co-author of Italian Science Fiction, The Other in Literature and Film. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you, Chris, for this opportunity.
So first, tell me, how did you get into studying and writing on this subject?
So I became interested in science fiction in 2005 when I started, when I was living in Italy, and Berlusconi was the prime minister. He was also the owner of three main TV networks, so my everyday reality, we had this kind of this president whose face was completely remade with plastic surgery. And he also owned these networks in which he presented a very problematic view of women. And so I approached the science fiction of James Ballard, in particular the Atrocity Exhibition, a text that was written at the end of the 1960s and talks about a man lost in this kind of mediascape. So science fiction for me wasn't really predictive. It was a genre that talked about the reality that I was living. And then I started to work on migration literature, on Italian migration literature, and I became really interested on the works written by migrants, in particular from the Horn of Africa, from Italy's former colony. Berlusconi was particularly proud of Italy's colonial past and Italian identity. So with this book, both myself and Daniele Comberiati, who is also an expert in Italian post-colonial and migration literature, we wanted to see how the themes of migration and colonialism are revisited in genre literature.
Mm-hmm. So I see that the book covers 1861, as the blurb says, the year of Italy's unification, to the present day. How do you lay out the book? Is it chronological, or do you go by themes?
We actually the structure of the book is chronological. We start from the role that science fiction played in creating Italian identity. Of course, the first patriots also wrote science fiction, and they imagined a future of this country that didn't exist. Italy was unified in 1861. And the role of science fiction was also important in creating national identity by contrast, by creating the other, by creating aliens. This also kind of created a shared idea about what humanity is, and in particular a humanity that spoke Italian and that started to colonize the world. One of the texts that we analyze in the book is called Giornale Illustrato dei Viaggi dell'Avventura, the illustrated journal of travels and adventures, and it's a strange mixture of science fiction text, explorers account, travel writing, anthropology, and so in these publications we have the first conflation of colonial idea, scientific ideas, and fantasy.
So it's interesting you mentioned travel themes, because writings on sci-fi go back to, you talk about Dante, or I read that even the adventures or travels of Marco Polo are considered in a sense proto-science fiction. So it's interesting that you bring up travel as a theme.
Yeah, there are some texts that refer to travel more directly, like Paolo Mantegazza, The Year 3000 is available in its English translation. And in this book, there is actually a honeymoon of two fictional characters who move from the United States of Europe to East. And it's kind of interesting that all the places where they go, they're represented as tyrannical, as inferior, as desert, where the Europeans have to bring civilization. And then at the end of the movie, the kind of this main character, Paolo, builds a panopticon, and the panopticon is portrayed as a solution of many troubles for humans, because this machine that can actually control what humans are doing is considered to be a great invention. It is actually interesting to see this machine and this invention, through Philip K. Dick, Minority Report, etc., where the idea of a control society, the idea of a machine that can actually see humans when they cannot, without them knowing, is actually a dystopic imaginary. But the idea of travel is also present in the text in multiple forms. Many of the novels or the movies that we analyzed are actually translations or adaptations of text, especially of American science fiction works. So they are texts that travel to Italy, but we don't see Italian science fiction as a derivative genre. It is precisely in the act of translation that Italian science fiction authors create a kind of different from the dominant American culture. No? So they always adapt some of the American science fiction work with a difference. A great example of that is the I Am Legend, the movie, the first version of the Richard Matheson's novel I Am Legend, The Last Man on Earth. This movie is actually an Italian-American production. It is entirely set in Rome. And it is interesting that the kind of urban landscape in which it takes place is the Eure, which has this rationalist, fascist architecture. There are also references to Italy's fascist past. There are actually, at a certain point at the end of the movie, those who haven't been contaminated, who haven't become zombies, are represented as black skirts, and they kill the last man on Earth. So in that adaptation, connecting the story of I Am Legend to some events that happened in recent Italian history, such as fascism and its legacy, with, of course, the obsession with race that is so present in fascist ideology and is also so present in I Am Legend. In I Am Legend, the main character is the last man on Earth. He has to kill these zombie-like figures, and at the end he finds himself to be the last, a monster actually, to this new race that is actually the majority on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting that by traveling this text from the U.S. To Italy, it brings in a new meaning to this text. On the one hand, for an Italian audience, we have the legacy of fascism and colonialism. There is actually a scene in which, the zombies, people who are infected, are actually thrown in they are killed. There is a mass extermination of these subhuman. And on the other hand, for the American audiences, they can see Italy, this new place that was, almost almost a colony for the U.S. in the sense that it was so important for the development of American cinema in the 1960s. So many American productions were present there. So many American bases were present on the Italian territory. The American cultural influence was also widespread in Italy, and they kind of see a resistance to that colonial fantasy, to Italy being a kind of Americanized place. In the movie, Italy is presented as almost an extension of America. As a monstrous extension of America, as a place that is where there can be an insurrection, there can be a resistance. In fact, I think about another monster movie that is set in Italy, 20 Million Miles to Earth. We have a similar story in which there is a monster who attacks the Earth. In this case, is Italy. Is actually first Sicily and then Rome. And the American army is present there and kill the monster without showing any presence of the Italian police. So it's kind of interesting that when we think about the peripheries of the American empire after World War II, we can think of Italy as one of those peripheries.
I'm speaking with Dr. Simone Brioni, co-author of Italian science fiction, The Other in Literature and Film. You can find his webpage at Stonybrook University, or you can find him on Twitter at Simone Brioni. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. Also, please follow, like, and comment on my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. You can find more information at YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter under Chris Alvarez FCN, or Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi. If you like military history, please check out the podcast Military History Inside Out, also at warscholar.org. And if you like space exploration, please check out the podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Now back to the podcast. So I wanted to ask about sort of fascism and science fiction. I think European fascism early on sort of embraced the idea of the future, in that they could engineer people and engineer their societies, and they saw a new, shiny future without imperfections. I think I get that sense, and I'm wondering if Italian fascists embrace science fiction in any way, or the futuristic writings or ideas.
Absolutely. On the one hand, we have, fascism wanted to reject American science fiction and everything coming from the U.S. And kind of Italianize, all cultural productions, because, of course, Italians wanted to watch American movies and read American literature. And we have the movement of futurism, so an artistic and social movement that originated in Italy in the early 20th century. For futurism, the idea of war, but the idea also of conquest is key. And in particular in the work of Filippo Tommasi Marinetti, perhaps because he was also, he was born actually in Egypt, and he kind of had to justify throughout his career his Italianness. He wrote his first manifesto in French, and then he translated it in Italian. The Africa really plays a role as the other, as completely opposed to the idea of civilization that is present that is ingrained in the idea of futurism, European modernity, and also connected with the idea of fascism.
Mm-hmm. Since the book does cover about a 160-year period, what would you say are the major periods for Italian science fiction within that range?
Yeah, I think what characterizes this story is the fact that there is no linear genealogy between the works of Italian science fiction, which means that most Italian science fiction writers, they read foreign science fiction rather than reading previous science fiction. So the history of science fiction is kind of consistent, yet at the same time there is no Italian authors look more abroad rather than being connected, creating a proper movement or discussions about certain themes. A period that I find particularly interesting are the 1970s. Because in the 1970s, since the beginning of the 1970s, mid-1970s, Italy becomes a country of immigration. And so we can see how a new Italian identity is formed, and of course on the level of the imaginary, and in particular in genre literature, one of the key themes of our book is precisely the fact that minor genres like science fiction is really a genre that it didn't receive any kind of scholarly attention in Italy. Minor genres, precisely because people, they weren't really interested in them, have very radical ideas about specific issues. In particular, the idea of racism. In the 1970s, for example, there are many texts written by women, and in the 1970s and also in the 1980s, that introduced in Italian culture the idea of intersectionality, of problematizing the idea of race and gender through a genre that not many people care about. And in the same period, in the 1980s, where actually migration became more widespread, and actually people could visibly see the presence of foreigners in Italian streets, there were also the science fiction genre, and in particular in association with horror movies or zombie movies, these kind of movies were very popular because the others were portrayed as invaders, as non-human figures entering the national borders, entering the nation, and perhaps spreading in the way very menacious figures, very threatening presences.
Mm-hmm. Everyone loves H.P. Lovecraft, and at this point I think it's commonly acknowledged that a lot of his horror comes out of sort of his racist feelings, that those who were different became his antagonists. And it sounds like Italy had that sort of issue too with its ideas of the alien or the monster.
Yeah, definitely. But there are not only these imaginary monsters. There is perhaps one of the most fascinating part of the book is the revisitation of the story of the history of Italian history through the use of alternate history of the alternate history genre. For example, Mario Farneti wrote this kind of neo-fascist alternate history in which Italy wins World War II and actually becomes a world power. But this is a celebratory view of fascism because still there is a divided memory of that historical period in Italian culture, and it is interesting that on the other hand, in the years 2000, there is another trilogy which was actually much more successful, written by Enrico Brizzi, and this story again imagines what would have happened if Mussolini won World War II, and imagines that fascism would create an alliance with Britain and actually win World War II. The first novel of this trilogy is set in the Horn of Africa, and describes an imaginary, soccer competition, soccer tournament, in which different teams from the Horn of Africa, they actually play against each other, and the main character is a journalist writing about, this tournament. But what is interesting is that the alternative history story that is presented there is actually, again, talking about Berlusconi's Italy, is revisiting fascism, showing how the rise of the Christian Democrat Party and the post-war period actually wasn't the end of certain ideas of fascism, and actually how the legacy of colonialism permeates contemporary Italian culture, because still not many people are aware of the fact that Italy actually had colonies.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So how much? It sounds like there's not much Italian science fiction that addresses embracing or becoming allied with the other. Is there sort of a more, I guess, a liberal bent in Italian sci-fi at all?
Yeah, definitely. There is a resistance to a certain kind of narration. Before, there are, since the years 2000, we have actually migrants writing their stories using the science fiction genre, and this is a very interesting, revisitation of the genre and response to this previous science fiction imaginary. In fact, we can actually see Afrofuturism as a specific response to futurism. But there are also, the dystopic genre, for example, has been incredibly rich, in particular since, the 1990s. In particular, redefining or trying to challenge the rise of neo-nationalist movements. In the 1990s, the Northern League, a country that originally actually wanted to divide Italy in two, became very popular. And several novels and movies have created this kind of dystopic world in which the North is separated from the South. I think about the movie Nirvana, which can be seen as a dystopic depiction of the tensions between an imaginary northern agglomerate and the rest of the world. Or Tullio Avoledo, dystopic novel about the memory of the Holocaust, which is also set in an imaginary northeast, The Girl from Bayonne, which is also translated in English, or Francesco Paterno's movie Cosa dell'altro mondo, Things of another world, in which it imagines what would happen in the northeast, which is one of the most productive industrialized area of Italy, if all the immigrants would disappear. So there are many novels and movies that have actually challenged this new nationalism and racist identitarian ideologies.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So for English-speaking audiences, I wanted to name a few productions and books, authors that people might be aware of, but wouldn't necessarily associate with Italian science fiction. And you just tell me, you can just comment on these names that I throw out here. I'll say them all at once. So Barbarella, famed 60s sci-fi, was, I guess, at least partly an Italian production. You have the show Space 1999 was, I guess, partly an Italian production. Dune, I think the 2000 version of Dune was partly an Italian production, and then the authors Italo Calvino and even Primo Levi are considered Italian science fiction writers in a sense. So if you want to comment on any of what I mentioned.
Yeah. Primo Levi, the entire work of Primo Levi was recently translated in English. He's definitely one of the most interesting writers, of Italian science fiction. He actually wrote his science fiction text under a pen name because he kind of wanted to distinguish this work from the idea of from what he wrote about the Holocaust and his experience in concentration camps. They are great stories. They're mostly about consumerism, and they are incredibly interesting and rich. Guido Morselli, Past Conditional, which was translated in 1991, is a great alternate history novel, which it's incredibly interesting. But then there are also many movies, before we discussed Nirvana, for example. Besides Primo Levi, Italo Calvino is of course translated in English, and Mario Soldati, The Emerald. They are both, let's say, bordering with fantasy. They are, what is interesting in Soldati's book is that he kind of imagines an alternative geography. In a Cold War, during the Cold War, so we don't have the Eastern and the Western Bloc, but a kind of a sinusoid dividing the planet into different parts. And I find this new geography very interesting because the Cold War in Italy wasn't cold at all, because there were, Italy had a very strong communist party, but was under the American influence, and so it's kind of interesting how many Italian science fiction works they kind of challenge this division between the East and the West by creating alternative geographies. Tullio Voledo, La ragazza di Vajont, The Girl from Vajont, is also an incredibly interesting text and is available in its English translation. It's a dystopic story which kind of combines the rise of new fascism, of new fascist groups in northern Italy with the disaster of the Vajont dam, which happened in 1963. And it's kind of an unusual love story set in Friuli region, Friuli completely beset by civil war, political instability, and ethnic cleansing.
So how extensive, thinking about the movies and TV show I mentioned, how extensive has been and is Italian film and TV sci-fi production?
Yeah, there are many Italian science fiction movies. Perhaps the most, one of the most important production is the movie Nirvana. It's a movie that tells the story of a virtual reality game designer, Jimmy, interpreted by Christopher Lambert, who finds out that the main character of his game, Solo, has achieved, has become real, has become independent. And so there is this cyberpunk interplay between the virtual reality and the reality that the video game creator is thinking about. There is Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster, one of the first movie by Mario Bava, which is a movie set in an imaginary Mexico, and it's one of the few Italian monster movies. As you have probably realized by all the movies and novels that I mentioned, hard science fiction isn't really popular in the Italian context, but there are also movies that that have influenced American science fiction. Planet of Vampires, for example, is a movie that has influenced Alien, for example. There are some scenes, the whole story of this movie, according to some, has influenced Alien. And then another interesting movie, which is a superhero movie, is they call him Jig. Lo chiamavano Jig Robot, made in 2016, which is a story of set in the peripheries of Rome, of a man who kind of becomes a superhero and fights the local criminality. But what is interesting here is that the superhero isn't necessarily good, no? The Italian superheroes, they actually behave like bad guys, no? We don't really have the separation between the good guys and the bad guys. I think this characterizes Italian popular productions. I think about, for example, Sergio Leone's movies and his westerns, where the good, the bad, and the ugly, they are all bad and ugly. So I think this kind of indistinct separation between good guys and bad guys kind of characterizes Italian science fiction.
I'm speaking with Dr. Simone Brioni, co-author of Italian Science Fiction, The Other in Literature and Film. You can find his webpage at Stonybrook University, or you can find him on Twitter at Simone Brioni. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. Also, please follow, like, and comment on my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. You can find more information at YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter under Chris Alvarez FCN, or Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi. If you like military history, please check out the podcast Military History Inside Out, also at warscholar.org. And if you like space exploration, please check out the podcast Spacewalks Money Talks, also at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Now back to the podcast. How did you do your research? Did you just gather together all the books and movies and TVs you could find and just go through them? Or how did you juggle all this?
Yeah, most of the... I found most of my books on Italian book stands or second-hand bookshops. Most of Italian science fiction can be found there, and it's actually very cheap. It was kind of interesting to look for Italian authors because very often they wrote under an American fake pen name because it was more marketable to pass for an American. So it was kind of interesting to look at what they were, to look in the book stands to find out which pseudonyms the Italian authors used. I found an entire collection. I was very lucky because I found an entire collection of the Journal of the Adventures and Travels in a book stand in Rome, and so that was very lucky. But so that was how I collected most of the books. I have to say that I have also met some people who were very important for my research. First of all, I met the son of Lucia Dermo, Marco Dermo, in Rome, and he talked to me about his mom, about her work, and about her very interesting story, because Lucia Dermo, which wrote this amazing book called They Will Leave, is a book about sympathetic aliens coming on Earth, and this book, so he talked about the story of her mom, who actually was a fascist sympathizer, and then she went basically voluntarily on concentration camps because she wanted to see if it was real if the story that you heard about concentration camps were real, and then she escaped them. She escaped concentration camps. She was lucky enough to escape, but she lost the use of her legs during a bombing. So she came back to Italy. She became anti-fascist, and she wrote about her experience in concentration camps in a book called Deviation, which has been published in English, and she also wrote this science fiction text, Partiranno, which is incredible. But also, I was very lucky because while I was writing a section of my book on Enrico Brizzi's alternate history novels, I actually met Enrico Brizzi, and I was able to talk to him about the novels.
And the films and TV, was that difficult to find?
No, it wasn't difficult because there are still some. I was able to find copies with in Rome. There are actually there's a community of fans which also directed me to gave me some copies of old movies or when I was talking about my research, they were actually very kind and gave me indications on how to find these movies. So I have to thank them. I have to say that I didn't grow up as a science fiction fan. I became interested in this genre later on because it seemed that it really talked about my reality. But I am not really in touch with with a lively community of fans that is present in Italy. So thanks to this research, I got in contact with this vibrant community.
What part of the research was most enjoyable for you?
A major part of my research is about migration literature, so I mostly read autobiographically inspired stories by migrants. Some of these stories are very tragic. So reading science fiction, even if the ways in which we approach science fiction was really pretty much oriented towards critical race studies, post-colonial theory, etc. But I found it very, very enjoyable that I was able to read stories that were necessarily about let's say stories, autobiographical stories.
Mm-hmm. What did you find that was most surprising?
Something that I found very surprising is this idea that it is through minor genres that major themes that are so relevant and so important in today's world are discussed. No? So the idea of racism, for example, wasn't really present for such a long time in Italian mainstream culture, but it kind of survived, was discussed in Italian science fiction, probably because Italian writers were reading American texts or British texts in which these themes were so important. The second idea is the idea of adaptation. I found it very interesting to see how translation, thanks to translation or by presenting a cultural product as American, certain ideas were able to enter into the Italian cultural context. And I'm also interested in issues of translations because translation is really can really be like a censorship. For example, I was reading the English translation of Mario Soldati, The Emerald, and it specifically talks about Roma. the Romani people, which actually have a very important role in Italian science fiction. They are surprisingly, this is something that I also find very surprising, they occupy a very important role in many Italian novels. And this whole part, which is actually, kind of about 10 pages of the original text, were completely cut off in the translation. Because that part was kind of untranslatable, perhaps, for the American audience, or wasn't really considered to be entirely science fiction. No? So I kind of find it very interesting how science fiction circulates, and perhaps something that is considered to be science fiction in a cultural context is not in another context.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm curious who made that decision to, whoever published it, made that decision to cut that part out. That's interesting.
The translator usually, but of course the same happened in Italy too. Of course, when it comes to popular literature, philology is not so important. So translators usually cut off consistent part of important science fiction novels. This happened all the time. Also when British American texts or foreign texts were translated in Italian. No, perhaps they had only a specific number of pages available, so they had to fit, let's say, 100 pages, so they cut off entire parts of major science fiction works. And I hope that, the scholarly interest in science fiction brings back also an attention about having translated in Italian some texts that perhaps were translated in the 1960s without paying too much attention to how these texts were translated.
Was there a difficult question in your research that it took a while for you to come to a conclusion on, or which maybe you still feel ambivalent about the answer you reached?
Yeah, to be honest, I think the work for this book was actually very prolific. We actually didn't have, Daniele and I, it was great to collaborate and to discuss our ideas because we could constantly check what we were saying, what we were writing, etc. But I have to say that after this book, we actually wrote a second book because we had this time in Italian, and it will come out it will be out in February. And in this book, we kind of extend some of the themes that are present in Italian science fiction, the other in literature and film. We also, in this case, the book is more thematic, and we talk about the time machine and how the time machine is present in Italian works to discuss the different temporalities of different places on Earth, which is still connected with the idea of colonialism. We discuss the idea of robots and how robots are included in science fiction and are usually feminized to talk about the role that women must have in Italian society. There is a chapter called Ital Exit, which discusses the fantasies of Italy leaving the European Union, and it's usually a dystopic. These are usually dystopic texts, and a text about the post-human, in which we discuss an incredibly interesting text, Sirens, by Laura Pugno, which is set in Japan and talks about a future in which humans will be replaced by these sirens, by these kind of half-human anthropomorphic figures. So it really discusses it really talks about post-humanism.
And you said that one's just going to be in Italian, though, not English?
Not in English, unfortunately. Yeah, I hope that this text, the text that we just published, actually, can contribute to have some of the books translated in English.
Yeah, because that second one sounds really important, too, for anyone interested in science fiction.
Yeah.
So what do you hope the book will do? Just educate people about Italian science fiction, or give them, what kind of ideas do you want to present to the reader that they come away with?
There are, we obviously have at least two readership from our American and British readers. I think it would be important to place Italian science fiction in the radar of global science fiction. Some years ago, a book locating science fiction came out, and it didn't even mention Italian science fiction, so it would be important to actually have to think about how Italian science fiction contributed to global science fiction. We have incredibly rich work such as Rank Xerox, which was influenced by Japanese science fiction, and also has an incredible influence in Europe and in the US. Frank Zappa actually chose Rank Xerox figure for his album The Man from Utopia. And on the other hand, for our Italian readers, we would like, of course, them to be aware of the importance of science fiction in Italian intellectual history and literary and cinematic history. But also, we would like to show how important colonialism, migrations, and the issue of racism is in Italian history. So I think we hope that our reader will become more familiar with the history of Italian colonialism and with its legacy on today's society.
Why do you think Italian sci-fi literature hasn't been fully embraced by English speakers? Is it simply the language barrier, or do you think just the themes didn't resonate, or what's the obstacle there?
The obstacle is that most Italian science fiction writers, they didn't associate with the genre. Calvino never called himself a science fiction writer. Levi wrote under a pseudonym. The other texts were also marketed, not as science fiction texts, but rather as crime stories or fantasy stories. So the few proper science fiction writers, they are minor within the Italian canon, and that's why they don't get translated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess, publishers would not see the money in it, so they sort of ignore it and move on.
Yeah, and I think there is also a tradition that associates Italy with realism, which, of course, it's an obstacle for translating science fiction. Audiences, when they look at an Italian movie, they expect a neorealist or a realist novel or movie rather than a fantasy or a science fiction novel or movie.
Yeah. Did you have any difficulties finishing the book or getting it published?
One difficulty is that Italy is a multi-centered country. So when we look at Italian science fiction, we have to consider that the history of Italian science fiction in Bologna is different from the history of Italian science fiction in Rome and in other cities. So becoming aware of these multiple stories was one level of difficulty. And then, of course, it was kind of difficult to we don't approach the genre from within the science fiction community or communities. but we come from outside. We look at this. We have an external position, not just because we are not part of this fandom, but also because we live in different countries. I live in the U.S. and Daniele lives in France, and so. One difficulty was also the distance from the text that we, or the cultural artifacts and the community that read these texts. But luckily, thanks to internet, communication is more easy, and so we're able to kind of fill in this gap.
So you mentioned the second book that's coming out in Italian in February. Do you have a writing project that you're working on or planning on beyond that one?
Yes, I actually am working on two different projects. One is a movie. I'm currently writing a movie with Genevieve Macapping. It's part of a trilogy of movies about African writers writing in Italian, and it will be set in Mantua. And the second writing project that I have is with Shirin Zanali Fazel, a writer who comes from Somalia, writes in Italian, and currently lives in Birmingham. And we are writing about a book about collaboration and the importance of collaborating in order to decolonize academia.
Interesting. Where can people find your work on the web? Do you have social media or webpage or anything?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, then my personal webpage on my website at Stonybrook University. There's a list of my publications, but also on academia.com. So yeah, I'm. But my webpage on Stonybrook on the Stonybrook website is the best place to find my publication and to contact me.
Your Twitter account, does that deal with your professional work, or is that more?
It's Simone Brioni. Mostly deals with my professional work. Is at Simone Brioni.
Okay, and
my first name and last name.
I'll spell that for listeners. That's SIMONE BRIONI. That's correct?
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. So that's at Simone Brioni on Twitter. Okay, so that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I would like to thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I learned a lot. I knew next to nothing about Italian sci-fi, and I feel like I know a lot more now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can find more interesting information like this on chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. You can also find the podcast on your favorite podcast feed under the title Full Contact Nerd. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please remember to rate this podcast. It really helps. We're on Instagram at Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and on Twitter at Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd. Don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thanks for listening, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.